Nobody saw it coming. The Wellington Ridge Country Club was built on tradition, status, and exclusivity. It wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of power, a place where the elite gathered to sip expensive scotch, close multi-million-dollar deals, and ensure that the right kind of people were in attendance. And that's exactly why Barron Trump knew they would have a problem with him. He arrived just after 8 p.m., stepping out of a sleek black car, his tall frame impossible to ignore. At 6 feet 7 inches, dressed in an expertly tailored navy blue blazer, he carried himself with an effortless confidence. Not the loud, attention-seeking energy people expected from a Trump, but something colder, sharper, more calculated. The invitation in his hand was embossed with gold lettering, proof that he was supposed to be there. And yet, as he approached the entrance, he noticed the moment the staff saw his name. There was a shift in the air. The doorman, who had been greeting guests with warmth and efficiency, suddenly hesitated. His eyes darted toward a man standing just inside the entrance, Richard Hargrove, the club's general manager. Hargrove was a man who had spent decades navigating the world of old money. He believed in gatekeeping, in deciding who was worthy, and to him the Trump name was a problem. Barron caught the slight nod Hargrove gave the doorman, and just like that, he knew exactly what was coming. The doorman straightened his shoulders as Barron stepped forward, his voice stiff with forced politeness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, but there seems to be an issue with your invitation." Barron didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow. He held out the invitation between 2 fingers, not saying a word. The doorman took it reluctantly, flipping it over before looking back at Hargrove for guidance. And that's when Hargrove stepped in. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, as if he were speaking to someone who needed to be put in their place. "There must have been a miscommunication. Your name isn't on our approved guest list." Barron tilted his head slightly. His smirk was barely there, but it was there. He could have argued. He could have demanded an explanation. He could have raised his voice, made a scene. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, studying Hargrove. A full 5 seconds of silence passed. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. Barron took a slow step forward, just enough to make the older man look up at him. "You know," Barron said casually, "I've been to a lot of places where I wasn't wanted." Hargrove swallowed. "Some of them," Barron continued, his voice smooth, "had the decency to at least pretend it wasn't personal." A few feet away, some of the other guests were watching now. Whispers passed between them. Barron could see their reactions, the ones who were entertained, the ones who looked uncomfortable, the ones who were waiting to see what would happen next. Hargrove's expression hardened. "Mr. Trump, this club has a strict policy." "Oh, I know," Barron cut him off smoothly. "Exclusive? Selective? Tradition." He gestured lazily toward the grand entrance. "I could probably quote your whole mission statement." Hargrove's jaw clenched. Barron leaned in slightly, his voice just low enough that only Hargrove could hear the next part. "But let's be honest," Barron murmured. "This isn't about tradition. It's about power." Hargrove's nostrils flared. "You like knowing you can control who walks through these doors. You like keeping people out. It makes you feel like you still matter." Hargrove took a step back. The tension was suffocating. Barron didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger, and that made it so much worse. Hargrove hadn't expected this. He had expected either arrogance or defeat. Instead, he got something colder, something that made him nervous. Barron sighed dramatically, then turned toward the other guests who were now fully paying attention. "Tell me something," he said, loud enough for them to hear. "How many people in that ballroom bought their way in?" No one responded. "I mean, I know a couple of them," Barron continued. "Know their fathers, know how they got their first deals. Funny thing about tradition, it doesn't seem to apply when there's enough money involved." A few people averted their gazes. Others whispered. Hargrove was seething. "Mr. Trump, I suggest you leave." Barron gave him one last look. And then, just to make sure the moment stung, he did something that made Hargrove's entire body tense. He smirked. Not a big smirk. Not a gloating one. Just enough. Enough to say, "I won." Enough to burn that moment into Hargrove's memory forever. Barron Trump turned on his heel and walked away. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply left them standing there, drowning in the weight of their own pettiness. And as he stepped back into his car, as the door shut behind him, he checked his watch. He had only been there for 3 minutes, and somehow in just 3 minutes, he had done what no one in that club had expected. He had made them regret it. The atmosphere inside Wellington Ridge Country Club had shifted. The usual hum of polite conversation, the distant clinking of champagne glasses, and the gentle strumming of a jazz quartet felt muted, like white noise fading into the background. People weren't focused on the event anymore. They were focused on what had just happened outside. Barron Trump had walked away without a fight, but the real fight was just beginning. At a round table near the ballroom entrance, James Holloway, a billionaire hedge fund manager, leaned back in his chair, watching as a server poured another glass of scotch in front of him. Across from him sat Charles Whitmore, a media executive with more connections than morality, his expression unusually tight. "That was a mistake," Whitmore muttered, tapping his fingers against the pristine tablecloth. Holloway took a slow sip of his drink. "It was stupid." Whitmore sighed. "Hargrove thinks he's protecting the club's reputation." Holloway smirked. "By turning away the son of a billionaire? With half the donors standing there watching?" He swirled his glass. "No, this wasn't about the club. This was about his ego." At the next table over, a group of younger guests, children of business moguls, lawyers, and old money families, were in the middle of the same conversation. A sharp-dressed young man, the son of a major investment banker, leaned forward. "I was standing right there when it happened," he muttered. Barron didn't even react, didn't argue, just let Hargrove talk himself into looking like an idiot. A woman across from him, a high-profile attorney's daughter, smirked over her glass of wine. "Honestly, that makes it so much worse for Hargrove. If Barron had made a scene, if he'd lost his temper, then maybe the club would have looked like it was in control. But now," she shook her head, "now it just looks petty." At a different table, 2 older members, longtime donors who had been part of Wellington Ridge for over 20 years, exchanged quiet glances. One of them exhaled sharply and muttered, "He should have just let him in." The other nodded slowly. "This is going to blow up." Meanwhile, the club's general manager, Richard Hargrove, sat at a separate table, gripping his glass of bourbon a little too tightly. His face was still slightly red, his posture stiff. He had felt in control when he turned Barron Trump away. But now, watching how many people were talking about it, how many eyes had turned to him, he felt something else, regret. But he wasn't the only one who noticed the tension. In the kitchen behind the ballroom, a group of staff members gathered near the service entrance. One of them, a waiter who had been standing at the front when everything happened, shook his head as he set down an empty tray. "That was the most uncomfortable thing I've ever witnessed." Eleanor Greaves, the event coordinator, crossed her arms and exhaled sharply. "It was embarrassing." The head chef raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" Greaves scoffed. "All of it. Denying entry to someone who clearly had an invitation? That's amateur. It makes us look disorganized at best, and at worst, biased." She picked up her phone, scrolling through her event list. "His name was printed on the guest list. I saw it myself." The chef smirked as he arranged a platter of appetizers. "Hargrove still thinks this place is run like it's 1980. Greaves exhaled sharply, dropping her phone onto the counter. "I've worked in these circles for years. I know power when I see it." She shook her head again. "That kid didn't even have to say much. He let Hargrove dig his own grave." At the main bar, another club member leaned toward his friend. "You know what's funny?" He chuckled, setting his drink down. "Hargrove thought he was making a statement, but now look at him. He's the one looking like a fool." His friend smirked. "Barron played that perfectly. Just stared at him, let him talk, then walked away. He didn't even have to win the argument. He let Hargrove lose it for him." Outside, Barron Trump wasn't thinking about Wellington Ridge at all. He was in the backseat of his car, the city lights flickering through the tinted windows as they drove back toward Manhattan. His phone buzzed once. A message. He glanced at it, unsurprised to see that someone from inside the club had already reached out. "Hargrove looks like he's about to explode. You barely said anything, and somehow he's the one embarrassed. Masterclass." Barron smirked slightly and locked his phone. He didn't need to say much. He didn't need to prove anything, because the real power wasn't in arguing. It was in watching them realize they had made the wrong choice. Inside Wellington Ridge, as the night continued, the conversations never moved on. No one cared about the charity event anymore. No one cared about the speeches or the auctions. The only thing people talked about was how Richard Hargrove had turned away Barron Trump, and how he had instantly regretted it. By the time the last guests were leaving, one thing had become crystal clear. Wellington Ridge thought that by banning Barron, they would be making a statement. Instead, they just made him more powerful. And Barron? He didn't even have to lift a finger. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.